Okay, resuming our discussion of the Great Civil War in Lebanon, one of the questions is why in 1975? Because if you recall, I mentioned beginning in 1970, we are seeing Lebanon inching closer and closer to a civil war. But why 1975? The answer to this question is heavily lies in the external environment. Specifically, it had a lot to do with Henry Kissinger and Sinai II agreement between Egypt and Israel. Sinai II was an interim peace agreement between Israel and Egypt that culminated in the 1978 Camp David Accord. Kissinger was putting very heavy pressure on Israel to accept the agreement, and really it was our doing. Now, the traditional leaders in Lebanon, after they saw pressure that Kissinger was putting on Israel, that pressure convinced the Maronites and other traditional sectarian leaders that the United States is once again willing to support them. In other words, willing to support these anti-change leadership, pretty much like the First Civil War. And so, in this sense, the same as was the case with the First Civil War, the conservative leaders decided to be more assertive in their dealing with the challenges that was being posed by the Palestinian. The traditional leaders and the Phalange party led by the Maronite leader, they once again believe that if they do assert themselves and try to take control of Lebanon, they can count on the United States. So when you look around the geopolitics of the region, you will see that Jordan is now pretty much on our camp. Egypt is very, very rapidly moving to join our side. So from the progressive perspective, it really seemed like a catastrophic development. But from the perspective of the conservatives, the anti-change traditional leader, everything seemed wonderful. The best way I can illustrate this is to illustrate the alliance pattern that existed at the time in 1975. And it was this alliance pattern that really convinced the conservative anti-change traditional leaders that the United States is serious about maintaining the status quo. So if you look at the alliance pattern, you see United States, Jordan is on our side, so is Saudi Arabia. Iran under the Shah is on our side. Turkey is on our side. And so this is what and Egypt now has moved on our side. So traditional Phalange thought they would also belong to this alliance. So therefore, with the United States serving as the linchpin, they would be there. Also, I did not mention, but we should definitely bring Israel into the picture. Prime Minister Begin had said that he was in an alliance with us. By the way, Iran was also very important because if you recall, Iran is overwhelmingly a Shiite country, Shiite Muslim. At this stage, the Shah of Iran actually begins to play with the traditional part of the Shiite community. Not Mosassad. Mosassad really belonged to the Khomeini group, but there are still traditional leadership within the Shiite that the Shah actually gives them some money trying to work with them. So when you look at this U.S. alliance pattern from the perspective of the traditional leadership in Lebanon and the Phalange, mostly Maronite, you will see that this is a pretty impressive leadership. The Phalange and the traditional leaders assume they will get a lot of international support from this group. Actually, they do get a lot of money and supplies, but they are not going to get what they wanted most, the active support, involvement of the United States and its surrogate. Now, if we compare this side with the other side, their opponents, it's kind of instructive. So if you look at the two main antagonists and their allies, you have the traditional, in Lebanon, you have the traditional phalange on one side versus an alliance of the Sunnis, the Druze, and Amal, the Shiites. So that's one side. And you will see that it's pretty much a mirror reflection of the Cold War itself. So if we begin with the United States versus the Soviet Union and looking at their respective allies, you will see Jordan, Egypt, Israel. I didn't put Israel in there because I was trying to look at mostly the Middle Eastern Islamic powers, and so it's Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. But you can certainly add Israel versus. Notice the dotted line from Syria, from USSR to Syria, Libya, and Iraq. The other side clearly, that is the side of the United States, clearly is much more significant than the Soviet side. And the dotted line really indicates kind of a not as formal alliance as we had, because the Soviet Union never supported their allies anywhere close to the extent that we supported ours. So USSR is aligned with Syria, Libya, and Iraq. But United States alliance is much more impressive. And so it was this kind of a pattern that these phalange and traditional leaders saw, and they felt that if they start the war, they could very well prevail. So we have the triggering incidents that we're going to talk about. But remember, the main target for this civil war is going to be the Palestinian. So the Palestinians are the real target of this civil war. The triggering incident was a Palestinian bus that was attacked in April of 1975 by the phalange. Several are killed, and that incident kicks off the war. Druze organized under a capable leader by the name of Kamal Jumblat. Their party is the Lebanese National Movement, and Jumblat is its head. They threw their lot with the Palestinian. When that happens, the government falls and general fighting breaks out. And in very short order, the conflict becomes sectarian, mainly between the Christian versus the Muslims. The Palestinian, interestingly enough, even though they were the main target, did not join the war right away. They formally joined the war later on in January of 1976 when Maronites attacked the Palestinian camps in eastern and northern Beirut. But the point was, once the Palestinians entered the conflict, they were far and away the best trained and very well equipped because they had built that infrastructure over the years for dealing with Israel. Also, once the Palestinians entered the conflict, you have many other Palestinians residing in Syria joining them. And with Palestinian participation, it really proved to be a game changer, and it became a very decisive factor in helping the pro-change group to begin to win that conflict and to dominate. It really began to look as if the traditional phalange alliance was about to be defeated by the pro-change forces. And then suddenly out of the blues, you got to ask yourself, who's coming to save the Christians? The answer is none other than Hafiz al-Assad of Syria. So on April 12th of 1976, Hafiz al-Assad sent Syrian troops to Lebanon on the side of Christians. This move, that is the decision by Hafiz al-Assad to go to Lebanon to save the Christians from defeat, perhaps more than any other factor, would deprive Assad from ever becoming an Arab nationalist leader. It also helped explain the rift between the Palestinian leader Arafat and Assad. Those two didn't have very good relationship. So now the question is, why did Assad really would do such thing? Why would he go and try to help the Christian against the Palestinian? Well, the answer is very similar to the one that we described in the previous segment. Remember, Assad was the Air Force commander who denied air coverage to Syrian tanks when they went to help the Palestinian. So why did Assad decide to go to the aid of the Christians? Because Assad suddenly saw the PLO and her allies were going to prevail and win the war, the civil war in Lebanon, and they're going to be dominating Lebanon. And if that comes to pass, PLO's, the Palestinian Liberation Organization's number one agenda would be to liberate the occupied areas. If that happens, this would mean that Israel will preempt and then will drag Syria into a war that would certainly defeat it. In other words, Syria would be prematurely getting tangled in a war, and also for that reason it would be disastrous for the Arab position. The other thing in this connection that I need to emphasize was this, and that is the traditional leaders, the Maronite leaders, the Christian leaders and the Phalange were all over solicitous, very, very solicitous to get Assad's help. So Syria's intervention on behalf of the Christian shifts the balance once again away from the pro-change forces toward the anti-change forces. And with Syrian troops fighting the Palestinians, Assad now joins King Hussein of Jordan, gaining the notorious distinction of killing more Palestinian than Israel had. So, with Syria's intervention on the side of the Christian, suddenly the Christian become energized and they become very assertive, and they really want to go for the kill. They want to finish off the Palestinian with that help. In the meantime, there is another exasperating factor that further fuels the conflict, and that factor relates to the Israelis' raid. As a kind of a brief history prior to that was that the Palestinians carry out an ugly raid against Israel. They hijack a bus and 35 Israelis are killed. The Israelis retaliate with ferocity under the operation that became known as Operation Litani, referring to the river Litani in Lebanon. And with the invasion of Israeli forces into Lebanon, they further upset the balance by creating now a puppet government, a puppet army, not government, made up of Christian mercenaries in the southern Lebanon. So the exasperating factor for poor Lebanon is that now in the south, the Israelis have created a mercenary army that is actually the mercenary army is created by the Israelis to prevent the Palestinian and also from raids and also to control that part of Lebanon. So we have a situation getting worse, and with Operation Litani leading to this army, the army is headed by one Saad Haddad, who was a Maronite leader. On July 1978, we have another change on the part of Assad, as the Christians getting more assertive, and with Israel involvement in southern Lebanon, now you have Assad once again changing sides. Assad shifts away from the Christians, and this is because it would appear that the balance had shifted too much in their favor. He does this in order again to restore the balance among the warring section. In the meantime, the phalange under President Bashir Gemayel, he's not as yet the president, becomes very, very close ally of Israel, and increasingly the phalange is beginning to look as a traitor to most Arabs. Also, I should point out that after the Sinai II, Egypt and Israel were steadily moving closer, and this momentum created by the Sinai II culminated in the signing of the 1978 Camp David peace accord. So now Egypt formally has really defected from the Arab ranks, and throughout the Arab world, this is now beginning to be realized that the most important Arab country is no longer among the ranks. So with Egypt gone, the most important Arab state being left out of the equation, Israelis are really no longer afraid of the Arabs. Notice that the Arabs are divided and more vulnerable than ever. At most, the Arabs can inflict ugly wounds, but certainly not mortal ones. So the question for Israel is what type of foreign policy to have vis-a-vis the Arabs. In 1981, the Likud party of Menachem Begin wins election, and Ariel Sharon becomes the defense minister. So 1982 becomes a very, very critical year for the Middle East, especially for Lebanon and for Israel. Arguably, one could say that in 1982, Israel had reached the highest point of its power relative to all its Arab neighbors. Notice Egypt was now out of the equation. They had a peace treaty, and they are now dependent on the United States for arms. We would never supply the kind of arms to Egypt that would threaten Israel. You also have the rest of the Arabs in disarray. And as a result of this sense of omnipotence that is felt by Israel in that period, circa 1982, you now get an Israeli foreign policy that can only be described as being motivated by a tremendous sense of grandeur. This means seizing the opportunity afforded by your exceptional power. So what does that mean for Sharon? For Sharon, this means Judea and Samaria. In other words, the West Bank. For him, this is the real Israel. And although other Israelis are divided on this issue, Sharon had no doubt about the importance of this. So now Sharon devises a strategy in which he thinks if he could follow it, he would be able to achieve the greater Israel. So that strategy is known as the Sharon option.